But would you, I mean, it was interesting that during your talk, Dennis, you stressed the idea of it being utilitarian in some sense, of being there for the betterment of humankind in some whatever way it was, whether it got people exercising more or volunteering more. And I was interested that you clearly feel that that's an important part of the tool. So it does have to have a purpose in that
well, I think what you
as
said,
opposed to just sharing.
Sure, what you were saying about Twitter kind of rings true. Like the 100 tweets that were on that board were not interesting to you. They weren't useful to you. They might have been useful to other people in the room, and that's different. It's difficult because it's a shared screen and difficult to pull off. But I think of all the stuff that we do. It's like it's got to make your life more interesting, and the way to do that is through utility. But utility is kind of it's difficult to make, and it's a pain in the ass to teach people how to use the utility. So you wrap it up in a game, and you kind of make it fun, and then people are like, oh, I'm doing this thing, and I'm earning points, and this and that. And before you know it, like people are doing things that they hadn't done, and they're meeting new people, and they're having these experiences that they haven't done before. And that's providing the utility. At the end of the day, people may not think it's Foursquare. They're just like, oh, I had a cool night. They may not think anything about that it came from us, but somewhere I think we help facilitate some of those experiences.
I think there's a perspective here as well, if you look at it from the context of as more than 50% of the world's population lives in cities, we're creating new ways of mapping our social infrastructure within very dense populated areas, which is a substantial transition from the kind of more sparsely sort of geocoded population base. So the kind of tools that we're developing enable creativity and enable interconnectedness in much more fragmented ways within densely populated areas.
I think also, certainly in the case of the social tools and of Foursquare, there's not a specific intent. I mean, I think in some cases we think of creativity being, I'm going to create something, as opposed to learning consistently all the time from the people who are using it. So you don't necessarily think we're starting Foursquare because we want to encourage this kind of behavior or personal change with people. But when you see people starting to use that, you think, okay, this is great. Let's support that and see where it goes. And so that sense about the interconnectivity that we're seeing and the tools allowing us to learn constantly from people who are using the things we've created. It's a very different, dare I say, paradigm. I mean, it's a really different shift from I'm going to create this because this is how I think people are, or the intention of how it should be used, as opposed to I'm going to put this out and see how people use it, and then we'll build based on what they want.
Is that how you feel about your art, Raghava? That you're just going to put it out there and see that it's less hierarchical proposal than you feeling I'm going to create this and the audience should like it?
It's very interesting because I have a similar problem with the purpose of creating art and then making it a product at the end of the day, because there is this sort of industrial sort of revolution notion about what art is and what it does for society. But for me, the real learning happens with the process. And so I actually go between selling an experience and selling a product. So I have both. I tackle both, and I just want to add one more point to what I'm trying to say. It may sound rather disconnected, but I think Facebook represents my philosophy in a very interesting way. That it's no longer based on interest groups, as you rightly said. It's based on public display of connection. The stronger man is he who is connected to more. And that drives me back to creating for myself and with my family, and unlearning being the most important part of my creative process.
So the quest for having 5,000 friends on Facebook, just for the sake of having the 5,000 friends, you mean at some point you shed that?
Absolutely, you have to. And I think someone said that the real value of technology happens after the excitement of it fades.
Right, but then Tim Wu was saying earlier, was something I thought he was saying that was very interesting about communication, which is that basically the forms of communication that work are the ones that everybody wants, because you want to be part of the reason Facebook is predominant over MySpace is because actually all your friends are on Facebook, they're not on MySpace.
Right.
So is there, again, you have this sense of homogeneity. I mean, he was talking about monopolies of communication and how that's existed through history. I just wonder whether we're not at risk of creating a society in which, because everybody has access to the same space and everybody has access to the same information, it's like, you drive through towns, whether it's in Kansas, Alaska, or Washington State, or Washington, D.C., and they have exactly the same stores everywhere.
But all empires fail. I think that,
Great.
that's always been the case, and it's unlikely to change. But even the kind of AT&T example, well, they are being undermined and have been undermined by the web.
I think, sorry.
Go ahead, Raghav, the show.
I think now everyone has access to information, and that's no longer important. Because in my family, I was below because they had trivia. They knew trivia about every stupid thing on earth. But now I can just pull up that trivia with Google. And I think what you do with it matters more than knowing or accumulating information. So,
Sure.
Yeah, sorry. Interconnectivity for me is not, maybe we're talking about the interconnectivity in the one area which is mainly relying on the utility and actual human interactions. But for me, the interconnectivity to something that goes beyond your imagination, such as climate or like economy, or there's a bunch of economists, but no one can really predict anything. But we are constantly shifted around, me personally, by it, and all those feelings that comes out of those, environment. The whole environment is for me a kind of catalyst of the interconnectivity. So it's not just about this information technology that I thought we were talking about.
Right. That it's
more,
broader than that.
Yeah,
I think
it's
so.
also partly the maturing of the technologies around it and how we interact with them. And in the same way, like in the early 90s, mid-90s, we were building all this stuff without any particular mission as to how we thought it was going to be used. It was like, well, if we can connect the world's information, if we can get it out there and enable access, things will happen. And we're only just making some of those things happen now. So the kind of utility that we'll get out of the social networks, we still haven't worked out, I'd say. We're still navigating towards the benefits.
I think a lot of the things that people are building now, like in the startup scene and outside of that, are, they're pushing harder and pushing faster because of the interconnectedness of everything. Like it's easier to be inspired, or there's more things to be inspired by, just because there's more things for me to know about. Like I went to this weird grad program at NYU, like half art, half technology, and we were there right around the time that it was the first class of people that were like blogging their projects, and people were doing this all around the world. And instead of just like, oh, I heard someone did the same project as me 2 years ago, you can go online and find documentation of this stuff, and it's like, oh, I'm not going to do the same thing. I'm going to do that plus one. And then you search that, it's like, oh, someone's already done that. We're going to do that plus something else. And it was like, that was a couple years ago, and that was pushing us hard then. And now, because there's so much stuff out there to find and read and to be inspired by, I think it's pushing everyone to do new things instead of just the same forms of trial and error again. So.
Dennis, when you look at the degree of interconnectivity and connectivity with other people that Foursquare is providing, which is sort of really at the cutting edge of making people in a community feel connected with each other and have access to each other's tastes and aims and interests. What happens in the world to the people who are not connected? I mean, does it create even greater disparities?
I don't know. I think
in the world
that example of the grad school example, I think, kind of rings true to some of that. Like, I think my work in school was better because I was researching, other things that people have done in the space. And I think some of the stuff that Foursquare is doing, which is like, allowing me to live vicariously through people that know what they're talking about, that's just making my experiences of familiar spaces better. Like, there's still people that are like, oh my God, I'm still having a great time, but I feel like I can, I have better filters than they do, and so I might have better experiences because of them. It's not ruining their experiences, it's just making the ones that I'm having a little bit more efficient and a little bit more interesting.
Sunny.
Yeah, I was just thinking about this notion of living life out loud, and I think that there's some people who are playing with the tools and some people who are deeply involved in their platforms, their Facebook and their Twitter and their Foursquare, and how that's so interesting because it's a kind of a public, a much broader public persona, and I know there's some people who really do it, and they do everything out loud, and it's interesting because it certainly can drive your work in a different direction, or it drives it harder. But I think the idea of filtering and sort of where you want to sit in that, where you want to live in that spectrum is an interesting choice to make, and it's one about whether it's protecting not so much privacy but a part of yourself, and the creative part of the parts you don't want everyone to know about. And I wonder, like, Dennis, how many is everything you do? Are you living everything out loud?
I think so. Like everywhere I go, I send it to Twitter and
Fascinating. I know,
Facebook.
it's really
Like
interesting.
every picture I take goes online. I've been doing this for years, for like 13 years since I first got to college and had the internets. And it's cool because everything I've ever done, there's like a history of it online. I can go back and like relive those things like through my own pictures and through my own voice, and it's better than having them dug in a shoebox. Like, so my mom does all her stuff and she can't find anything, but like my 23rd birthday party is like 2 clicks on Google away. And that's kind of a nice thing to have.
What about secrets?
Yeah, secrets and shit.
Well, I think it's interesting. Like, we're getting to that point now. This is a really interesting conversation. But, we're getting to that point now where, like, okay, if you fast forward a year, maybe everything will be tracked. Like, instead of checking in, maybe it just tracks you. But I don't think people want that. I don't think anyone in this room wants that because that's when secrets go away. Like, a lot of things work because you can tell these white lies. Like, if I don't want to check in somewhere in Foursquare, I just don't tell Foursquare, and I can be off the grid for a little bit. And, if I don't want to share my thoughts through Twitter, like, I don't have to do that.
But the very fact that you are off the grid for a bit signals to people that you are doing something that you don't want them to know about.
Naughty boy.
Yeah, well, but that's kind of the mystery of it.
Because
like,
you
it's
are
like
on the
training.
grid so much that 2% of the time that you're on.
Yeah, but then it's like, what is he doing? Then it's like, then it's interesting.
That enhances the mystique.
It's a different type of content,
Yeah.
I think it's a sort of a pseudo honesty then, because then you can never entirely be honest. That's what I believe. So I think just like everything around us, there's pseudo shift in power, and I think this is just another. I mean, it's not a personal attack, but I just think that's the way things are going.
Sure, it's interesting what you say about Japan and that they're putting walls up again, because, I mean, I'm out of date on what it's like in Tokyo, but my understanding is that actually the Japanese were way ahead of the Americans when it came to mobile, having mobile technology and tracking each other and all the kinds of things like Foursquare, and that people are doing that a lot in Japan. But you have also there a culture which is quite private. Mm-hmm. How does that marry? I mean, how do people share everything they're doing whilst retaining autonomy or a sense of independence from everybody else?
I don't live there now, so I'm just kidding.
Hey, I get asked about what the world thinks all the time.
The privacy. Yeah, but some people, the young generation is totally different, I think. They really share everything. But it's true that Japan had some years ahead of the kind of interconnectivity using the mobile phone, but it's completely overridden by Apple or Facebook or all these.
It's interesting.
But somehow I think still the language prevents it from making it a little bit more participating to the worldwide level. But I don't know. It's very difficult how that society really works.
One question is how much...
That's an understatement.
how much privacy do you think you already have? I mean, your mobile company already knows who you are. And as I mentioned earlier, you can work out mode of transport from how quickly you're traveling and where you're traveling. Your credit card owner already knows everything you purchase, where you purchase it. Your store card knows all this. So there already is a wealth of information, and what we're doing now is just kind of touching the edges of what can I publish and what can I have control of, as much as what do other people have control of. Mm-hmm. So there is a kind of junction here between kind of personal data and personal data owned by organizations. That I think is kind of really interesting one to unpack. And smart meters is one example of that as well. You can say, well, I can tell, we can identify not only that a fridge was switched on, but which make and model is it, and does it have a faulty pump? That kind of information is coming through these kind of networks, and it becomes part of your sort of data shadow or